Hey, what's up? I'm your host, Eric, and I want to welcome you to episode 2 of the My First Ultra podcast. And we have an amazing guest today, no other than Jeff Browning, who took time out of his busy Cocodona schedule. So if you've been paying attention to that race over the past couple of days, or if you're, following this up, months or a year from now after he raced it, he did amazing. So just want to say thank you, Jeff, for taking the time again out of your busy training schedule to join us. The reason for this podcast is because I believe in ultra running, not only for the physical benefits that you get from it, but from the mental. I believe it builds belief and confidence. And if you're just starting out, the reason for this podcast is to help you every step of the way, because I believe that experience is the best teacher. And then second best is learning from somebody who's already been there and done that. So I share tips on ultra running through my own personal experience and through our special guest people like Jeff. And I encourage you to stick to the end because not only does he share a little bit, I mean, a lot about his first, how he got into ultra running and his first ultra experience, but his new venture with KEEN shoes and how he is helped like shape trail running shoes and is going to answer a lot of your questions about what kind of shoe should I be wearing? Should I be wearing multiple shoes during my training? Can I stick with one shoe? Are drops good or no drops good? Stuff like that. He answers and he does a deep dive into that. So again, let's get right into it. And then also, if you are new to ultra running, there's a link down below that you can grab a free PDF that I made that shows you what it takes to become an ultra runner, or if you're on track with your training, just like a couple milestones and benchmarks to hit in your ultra training and what it takes to get there. So with that, let's get down to business with Jeff Browning. I think Jeff, above all people, doesn't need an introduction. He's been around the sport since near the beginning, early 2000s-ish, if I'm correct on that, and
2001.
2001. And so he has a ton of experience and comes from a neat background too, which I'm sure he'll get into before he started actually getting into ultras, and just how that molded him and shaped him. What kept you coming back? Like what, it's so intriguing to you about the sport to keep you coming back for 20 plus years. So with that, we'll hand it off to Jeff and then we'll end with a Q&A at the end.
Yeah, I mean, the early days I was I've always done sports, but I grew up on a farm in Missouri in the 70s and 80s and went to college, University of Missouri, and got into mountain biking. Was in like made traditional kind of American sports before that, football, basketball, baseball, track and field. Um, did well, really well in track and field, but I was really focused on football in the 80s. And then ended up going to college and got it somehow just my circle of friends, social circle got into mountain biking in the early days and we're kind of early adopters. Ended up working at a bike shop and it actually ended up, this is my introduction to kind of like official running races, post like track and field in high school. I worked at a bike shop that was also the specialty running shop in Columbia, Missouri, where University of Missouri is. And so all the hardcore runners that ran marathons, triathletes, all came in, got their shoes from us. And so I worked the retail floor, but I considered myself a mountain biker. But I was dabbling in running like 3 or 4 days a week. And I ended up really kind of dabbling in like 5K, 10Ks, 10 miler at that time. And then I was like moved out west and I just really got into climbing and mountain biking and kind of kept running 3 or 4 days a week, just to keep my dog from chewing up cushions and stuff, on the couch. And then when I moved to Bend, Oregon in 2000, my first friend in town got me into ultra running. He would just run a 50K, he'd run a few marathons. And I also, the owner of that shop that I worked at had run Boston Marathon like 25 times. So there was a little bit of like just this background, planting seeds in my head that, oh yeah, someday I'll run a marathon. And then, I fast forward, this guy in Bend, this guy, my buddy Rod, um, who owns the Patagonia store in Bend, Oregon. He introduced me to Western States 100, that it existed. At the time, he was working for the North Face, and North Face was the main sponsor. And he kind of we had a we had a 1999 documentary that the North Face put out, on Western States on VHS tape.
Hmm.
And we got together for dinner on Tuesdays before we had kids. He was newly married. His wife and my wife worked at an internet startup together in Bend, Oregon, and he and I lifted at Gold's Gym together. And we used to get together for wine and smoke cigars. And we started watching these videos, and we started saying, "Man, we should run that race." And it's kind of like that thing where you go, "Oh, I want to run a marathon," like check a box.
Mhm.
That was kind of like, well, I want to run Western States, check a box. Well, then I found out you had to like qualify uh and get in a lottery. And then it was like, wow, I can't just jump in it. Okay, so I had to learn. I started running. I ran a half marathon, a marathon in 2000, then ran a 50K in 2001 and a 50 miler to get my qualifier. Back then it was a 50 miler. And it was back then, if you guys have ever tried to get into Western States, it was 50% chance in the
Hmm.
lottery. So what is it, 0.005% now or something?
Yeah.
In the lottery, it's crazy. But I mean, we got in the first year with our qualifiers. So I ran the 2002 race as my first 100, and I got hooked. And in that 18-month window of like training in 50K and doing a 50 miler, did a me walk 100K. And by the time I kind of showed up at Western States, I was pretty like connected with the running community in Bend and in Oregon. And because there was an Oregon Ultra Series, and I was kind of running some of those races and meeting that bigger community in the Pacific Northwest. And it was kind of a hub at that time. The Montreal Patagonia team, one of the first sponsored ultra teams, was based out of Montreal and Seattle. And so there was this big like kind of West Coast scene for ultra running that was just starting, and I really got to kind of like attached to that community and how cool it was, and then just kept racing, got sponsored, and then became a coach about 10 years ago, um, and kind of just stuck with it. Really kind of honed my skills in the 100-mile distance over the years. I've done 5500s now, or 100 plus. I count the 200s in there too as my 100
Yeah,
finishes.
for sure.
Um, but I also had success in like '05 on, had started having success with some wins at the 100-mile distance, and then later at other ultra distances. So, fast forward, I started working um, on some footwear development. I'd always worked in specialty running in some capacity, whether it was like on the retail floor in college. And then later, I was a graphic designer and had my own graphic design business in Bend, and I helped the local foot running store uh, kind of brand and market their shop. And so I was around footwear constantly. I was my best friend in town. One of my best friends in town was the owner of the shop, and so we were about the same age, and so we ran together all the time. We had coffee meetings all the time. I was in the shop every day, pretty much, talking about shoes. They had a huge trail wall, probably one of the biggest trail walls in the U.S. With the amount of shoes they had. They had a whole dedicated trail wall and a dedicated road wall, kind of like Run Flagstaff has, and only it was even bigger than what Run Flagstaff has. And so I was like super geeking out on shoes all the time. In those early days, when I became, Montreal Patagonia became, Columbia bought out Montreal, and then that became a conflict of interest. And so I was on the grassroots first year Patagonia ultra running team, and they didn't do footwear at the time. So I was like, oh, cool. So I could run in anything. So I had this deal with the shop where I could run in any kind of footwear, and I was super geeking out on shoes, and that we went through the whole barefoot movement and born to run movement that kind of really shaped the footwear industry and changed the drops. All the drops came lower and lower and lower and lower until Ultra showed up on the scene and in 2011 with a zero drop shoe. And I was kind of geeking out on that barefoot movement, kind of running in some barefoot stuff, the Vibram Five Fingers, and more for strengthening and stuff like that. And like everyone else in that time, everybody tried to run too in them, and you got injured. So unless you grew up barefoot on a beach or something with strong feet, most people haven't in the U.S. So like we had all kinds of injuries around that time. But it really, really drove like footwear development. And around that time, being a graphic designer, Patagonia came to me and they had teamed up with Wolverine Worldwide in Michigan that owns like a ton of footwear brands. They own like Merrell and like um, Timberline and a whole bunch of other brands. And they were teaming up with Patagonia to create footwear. And they started out with some casual footwear and then they wanted to get into performance footwear. So I helped with a shoe in like 2000. It debuted in 2014, but like 2011, 12, 13, we were developing that shoe. That was my first like thrown into the deep end of footwear development. But as a graphic designer, it was a natural kind of progression being a designer, to understand like I'd been in retail on the retail side of like how people buy shoes, how they go try them on in the store. You can all appreciate that time when you like pop into a store and you try on four pairs of shoes and you
Mm-hmm.
put that one pair of shoe on that you go, oh, that's really good, and that's your shoe.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I understood that part of like the business. And so, that first step in and all those different little points would make you end up purchasing a shoe. And I have a pretty common foot. And so like like the shape of it and everything. So I kind of fit in all the big sellers, fit me really well. And so I was kind of an ideal candidate for getting into footwear development. And especially from being, a sponsored ultra runner too, and running 3,000 miles a year, I was a perfect candidate as a tester as well. And so, you know, we debuted this shoe in 2014, and mid 2014, Patagonia decided they nixed all footwear. They wanted to get out of the footwear business completely. They just wanted to stay with outerwear, like they where they where roots were. They didn't want to get into that other factories and deal with that. And so they made a business decision to pull out. And I was like, wow, I was working on a second shoe. I was like, man, that sucks. And I was an outdoor retailer in Salt Lake, and Ultra approached me um, during that. That's how you used to go see your sponsors, was outdoor retailer in Salt Lake City. And because it was a giant outdoor industry, booths everywhere. Now it's the running event in Austin and San Antonio. But back then it was in July and it was in Salt Lake. And I would always make the trek to Salt Lake just to see sponsors in person. And uh, Ultra approached me and said, "We're going to send you some shoes. Try them on. Our test size is your size." Um, and so I was like, "Wow, I'd get prototypes early if I'm your test size, right?" So I was the same size as two of the three founders. And that was their test size. And at the time, that was like so out of the norm because the test size was men's size 9, and I'm a 10 and a half. And so it was like so cool to be like, oh, what? Your test size is 10 and a half? Sweet. And so then that started a long-term relationship with Ultra. In the early days, I came on when they were 4 years old, at the end of 2014, helped them with testing. I moved to Logan, Utah for a couple of years before they left Logan and got bought by VF and moved to Denver. So in the early days, I was like really, really involved in footwear development. And that really cut my teeth in like the process and understanding the process to a next level. And then I became kind of a tester after VF bought them out, and I was kind of getting to the point where I was like, I'm just a tester now. I don't have any direct feedback that often because they're in Denver. It's a giant company. VF's has 8 brands under one roof, and my this is how the KEEN thing came about from a footwear development perspective. um, Keen, my crew chief, who I've had since, if anybody's seen The Chase,
Mm-hmm.
my from Cocodona in 2024, that film that Aravaipa put out. Um, my crew chief George Plumerity, who is interviewed in that thing, he's been my crew chief since like 2010 or 11, so about 15 years. In some of my biggest races, biggest wins, and he became the head of run at KEEN because KEEN wanted, they've been in the outdoor industry for 20 years and mainly hiking and sandals and performance sandals. And they wanted to get into performance footwear. There's a ton of hardcore runners at that place in Portland. Portland's kind of a big running scene, right? Hoka's headquarters are there, Nike's headquarters are there, On's headquarters are there. I just heard On is moving to New York for their headquarters, so that tells you a little bit about On. They're a little bit of a fashion brand. Um, they're not a hardcore performance brand. Anyway, that was a little dig on. I like to give George a little trouble because George, one of the reasons he moved to Portland is he landed a job at On. He was at Patagonia for 17 years. And after COVID and everything, he kind of bounced around, went to Mondrager Bikes, and then ended up at On, and then for a few years, but then got the job at KEEN. And he called me and said, "Hey, what would it take for you to come over for footwear? Like for one as an athlete, like as our first, you and Chrissy Mail, because Chrissy and I." If anybody knows Chrissy Mail, she was the first American woman to win UTMB back in the 2000s. She won it twice. She used to have the Tahoe Rim Trail FKT, women's FKT. Really tough runner. Had kind of like stepped away from racing the last 10 years in her 40s, but she still like is the race director at Chuckanut for the last 24 years. She's like big community person. And so we both kind of they had got her to come over and we had been teammates for a long time at Patagonia. So they brought both of us as veterans over as their first athletes, first ever athletes they've ever sponsored. And then they really brought her over for community and brought me over for footwear. So not only are we athletes, but we also are like part of our sponsorship is helping with that specific piece of the business. And so I'm doing a lot of testing. I'm on, and I said, if you know, one of my things um, in that discussion before I signed off was that I was like, I don't just want to be a tester. I wanted to be like involved in direction and footwear development and innovation and materials testing, and also like new foams, new outsoles, stuff like that, outsole materials. But also like I wanted to be able to talk about the concepts of where we were going with the line before it was built. And one of the things that you find out in footwear development is um, the form or the mold, which is a metal mold they make that's 30 grand when they release to make the mold, is what the midsole, the foam, and the outsole, it's basically what everything's poured into. So once you decide on that, the direction of that shoe is decided for 3 years. So ideally for 3 seasons. And you might do an upper change where you might redesign the upper itself, the upper material, but you can't change the mold, right? And you have to make your money back on the mold. So that's one of the like secrets of the industry that's frustrating. So if you get a mold that's not very good, you gotta like you're stuck with it for like 2 or 3 seasons, unless it's a big brand that's willing to just ditch it and start a new mold. So knowing that, I wanted to be on the front end when they were looking at 2Ds and 3D plastic prints of the mold before they release it to like all the sizes. So, or even the test size. So that was kind of how I got involved with KEEN. That's kind of my background in footwear development. I mean, I know that's kind of what we were going to talk about tonight was footwear development, a little bit of my history in the sport. Um, I think that's it. That's kind of like a quick download. That was as quick as I could do it.
Well, so going back to when you very first started, yeah, because you were a mountain biker first, how much do you think that influenced your shoe design? Because I grew up racing dirt bikes, and I know when I'm out running, like I look at lines differently than someone who grew up running compared to my dirt bike background, as far as like going over rocks or like scooting a berm made by mountain bikes and stuff like that. So do you think that helps or changes
Yeah,
the way you?
I think one, you're never descending on trails running at the speed you're going to mountain bike. So picking a line, like skiing, picking a line is like a little different. You scan ahead farther. You already have that kind of ingrained in you to scan ahead, look at front of you, scan ahead, look in front of you. Whereas in trail running, you tend to like just look at right in front of you. And sometimes you can like, miss a turn, right? Because you're so focused on your feet. But I think mountain biking teaches you to scan ahead a little bit, or at least do a snapshot in your brain ahead, 40, 50 yards, and then back to the details. So I think that does help. That mountain biking background definitely helps. And it definitely helps for me personally it's always my first thing to go to when I'm fighting a niggle or a little extra soreness or I'm beat up. Or I'm like, oh man, like, calf is really, really tight, and I probably shouldn't run on it for a couple of days. Instead of forcing it, most of the time, I'm pretty quick to jump on the bike and spin a day or two. We have a thing in our coaching business, we call it the 2 day rule. If you're dealing with a niggle, go do cross train on something that will keep your base fitness, but does not aggravate the issue. And the bike is really good for that because one of the things I like about the bike is you're spinning at a higher cadence than you can actually run your speed work at.
Mhm.
But you're in zone one, zone two heart rate. And so if you really focus on high cadence, you can really be wiring like leg turnover, but getting zone one, zone two aerobic recovery, heart rate wise. So it's a great way to build this giant base. And I think that's one of the things that, like, once I could handle some mileage, worked on strength and some of my imbalances in the first few seasons of ultras. I think that's one of the reasons I had success, you know, my fifth year in the sport, because of all that. I had a decade of like mountain biking 5, 6 days a week, and strength training since I was like 14 years old, being in the weight room. So I think the combination of those two things were really instrumental in my foundation of kind of being resilient and in setting me up for longevity, but also helping me build that big base that I just needed to adjust to the pounding part of the sport, which took about a decade, to
Mhm.
be honest. It took a decade to really like before my annual mileage kind of plateaued.
Yeah. So um I guess what was the kicker? What hooked you on the sport from the couple first trail races to running, other than getting inspired by watching a VHS video of Western States,
I
but
mean, it
when
really
did you
was
know
like,
like this I'm hooked. This is what I want to do.
I think for me, it was like, well, a couple of things. One was the community. I felt like it was this really cool kind of mentorship community where, like, some of the older guys in town at the time, well, now they're not so old, but at the time they were in their 40s and I was in my 20s, and they took us under a wing and showed us like all these cool routes to go run, and like, hey, here's where we do a 20 miler with 5,000 feet of climbing, and here's the water bottles handhelds you should use. And because back then we didn't have packs. There was no like, the packs were backpacks. They were so heavy and big and clunky. So everybody just like tied a Patagonia Houdini around their waist, like windbreaker, and like had two handhelds. But and maybe a little stretchy fanny pack to like put some gels in, or pocketed shorts. But so it was pretty minimal back then. But they were showing you like things like, oh, here's how you should be taking, an S cap with your drink, to get electrolytes, and here's the gels we use. And back then it was goo or, power gels or whatever. But that's kind of what really, like, it was kind of this mentorship atmosphere that I think was really cool. And I think the other thing that really attracted me to the sport in the early days is coming from like mountain biking, backpacking, and climbing. Backpacking and climbing uh and mountain biking are all those three of those sports are very gear intensive. And so you're always like, oh man, I gotta, you have a mechanical on your bike like 15 miles in, and a couple times you get burned where you like double flat, you go through your tubes, you have no patch kit left, and you have to hike out in SPD shoes for, 10 miles. That sucks. So like that was kind of a cool thing, the aesthetic and the kind of the primal of it, of how simple and quick and light and fast you could go. And then as a mountain biker, I was always limited to uh, where I could ride. Some trails were closed to mountain biking. If it's too technical or too steep, you couldn't ride a mountain bike
Mhm.
up it. Whereas in running, it kind of took all these disciplines of like light and fast, like tagging a summit or a peak, and so there's some scrambling and climbing involved, but you're doing it really light because once you're fit, you can go forever. So
Mhm.
like that, I think that's really that simplicity and the aesthetic of it was really cool and simple and clean.
Yeah. So was your fitness already pretty much there when you started because of the mountain biking and climbing and
I
stuff?
had good fitness, but I was just plagued in the first 3 seasons with like, IT band syndrome, runner's knee, you
Mm,
know, that kind of stuff, where it was just like I had these muscle imbalances from all the bike cycling years,
mm,
like hamstring, quad muscle imbalances that I actually ended up in '04, off season of '04, '04, '05, and '05, '06. I worked with a strength training coach for about 18 months where I did personal training once a week during the season and twice a week in the off season. It was one-on-one. I was a graphic designer, so I'd trade out. So I was able to like finagle a deal. I couldn't afford a personal trainer, but I was like, man, he was like, dude, I'd love to pay. I can pay you this much, but like, can we do some trade out? And I was like, heck yes. So I had this personal trainer that I was going and working an hour workout once or twice a week. And he's the one, he was a ex-Marine, had been a power lifter for the Marines. And he was like really big on just strength, right? Strength to weight ratio. Because powerlifting's all about like it's like wrestling. It's like a weight class, right? As strong as you can be for your weight class, which is really what we want in endurance sports, right? Is a big strength to weight ratio. So he really helped me like diagnose like, hey, your quads are supposed to be 1.5 times stronger than your hamstrings, and you're actually the opposite. Because I had had all those years of being clipped in and pulling on the backstroke on a bike, so it really overdeveloped my hamstrings and kind of underdeveloped my VMO, which is that teardrop kind of muscle that's right above your knee on the inside of your quad,
mhm,
that inside muscle of the quad. And I was just kind of weak there, and it was causing, patella maltracking and tendonitis, stuff like that when I would bump volume up. So I was still having to go back to the bike a couple days a week to manage. I couldn't do high volume. I could run like 4 days a week, and then I'd have to bike 2 days a week or something like that. So once after working with him one off season, and I quit having knee issues. Um, and then after two, I quit having injuries, except for like weird stuff like plantar fasciitis once, just from running in really crappy long run in snow, and really irritated my feet. And that was kind of in those early years of the barefoot movement happening. And I was trying to strengthen my feet at the same time. And I had some weaknesses in the feet that I had to kind of work through. And I think that's another thing that has always attracted me to the sport is if you want to stay in it, you have to be curious. You have to be like willing to say, nope. And when people go, maybe you're not a runner, and be like, no, I'm a runner. I just have to figure out this imbalance that's going on, or this, or what's
mhm.
weak in the chain, or what's too tight in the chain. There's always a fix. There's always a solution if you can like work up and down the chain and like sleuth it out.
Yeah. And then so from there, um, when you're developing a shoe like with man, I can't even imagine how many different shoes you've worn through your career.
Oh
Like
man,
like what are you looking for? Like what
my last garage sale, I've sold 72 pairs of shoes.
yeah.
Some of them were still in the box.
So, 'cause how tall are you?
5'8",
Okay. So average
5'8",
size and
140.
okay. So, for most runners out there, like that's pretty average, especially in the ultra scene. So, what are you looking at for when you're like developing a shoe? Like, especially coming from ultra, running a lot of years in zero drop, and then when they came out with the forward, that kind of changed ultra a little bit. But I think I remember you finished Cocodone in it, right?
Yeah,
Or
in the
yeah,
wild.
in the wild, and then
So
so
4 mil drop.
right, so you started using a drop again, and I think like different people, all have different taste, but what taste are you looking for?
Well, so for me personally, like all the years, um, well, let's back up. There was a discuss. Let me give you a little context. There's always been an ongoing discussion at Ultra, like should we stay zero drop? The two of the founders were hardcore about it. They were like, nope, zero drop only, right? And then one of the founders, who's still with the company, Brian Beckstead, he had worked the retail side most of his life before he got into Ultra. He had worked for Golden Harper's dad at Wasatch Running Company, whatever it's called in there in Utah County. So he had worked as a manager there, so he understood the retail side really well, and he's been on the sales side and marketing side forever. So he understood that we have customers. And if you only do zero drop, you're
Mhm.
automatically taking away a percentage of customers. And he understood that, hey, people are always asking, hey, can we get a transition shoe, like a 4 mil drop that we could like transition to the zero? And there had always been this, and I came from the retail side too, and I was like, yes, we should be doing that. We should be making, because the research that's come out since 2016, there's been multiple studies on drop and showing that once you go over about a 5 or 6 mil drop, it affects your gait, meaning you're going to heel strike more often. It's going to cause you to heel strike. So the higher the drop, the more you heel strike. That heel, just like a boxing glove, the number one, well, I should ask this to the group. What do you think the number one injury is in boxing?
I would say a sprained wrist.
It's actually shoulder.
Hmm.
So because they're taped and a big pad, it actually transfers the force up the arm into the shoulder joint. So the same thing happens when you strike in a bigger stacked shoe. You're going to drive the force away from the ankle and lower leg to the knee and hip. So what? So this had been an ongoing discussion in the background at Ultra all these years. While I was there for 11 years, and it was always kind of a talking point, like should we make it? And finally, it was like, yes, we should be making a 4 mil drop shoe with a rocker because it doesn't affect your gait, right? But it also allows us to go grab more customers from that demographic that's like zero drop does not work for me. And so we were always having that discussion. Now, for me personally, one of the things that attracted me to in during the barefoot movement, because everything was over an 8 mil drop, 8 to 12. There were even some higher drops than that. Um, I had a lot of like in those early days, I was having like hip, IT, and patella now tracking and knee stuff. And all of those are related to a higher drop shoe. Like the literature definitely backs up that if you're fighting knee stuff a lot and hip stuff a lot, check your drops. You shouldn't be in a high drop shoe. Now, I would say this, if you're moving down in drop, you have to give yourself transition time. For me, it took a year of transition time where I was running in like a 4 mil. I had already transitioned to a 4 mil drop when I went to Ultra and they only had zero. So that transition was pretty quick for me, but I had tight calves the first season because I was running in them all the time. So I had to kind of like take some other brands that I had in the garage and wear them every other day until I could get like wean off of them over about 6 or 8 months. But either way you go, it's going to affect you in a different way. So if it's in a thinner shoe will like put more force in the ankle and the lower leg below the knee, and a more padded shoe, a more cushioned shoe will transfer just like a boxing glove, will transfer that up the hip and into the knee and hip. So one of the things you always want to think about is like, oh, my feet are beat up and you're in training. Well, then you should probably get in a cushion shoe for a day or two while your feet recover. But let's say you have like hip or knee stuff going on, that's sore or like a little irritated or something, but you can still train. You don't invoke the 2 day rule. Then you should go to a thinner shoe, right? Because that will transfer that force down to the ankle and lower leg versus up to the knee and hip. So these are like two strategies that you can play with, and that's why I always when I talk about shoes, it's like, what's the ideal shoe? I know I'm taking me a while to get to your
Yeah.
answer, but one of the reasons I'm taking a while is because I want you to understand that like it's not one shoe, it's a quiver. And I think ideally it's probably a trilogy.
Mhm.
So it's probably like a lower, thinner shoe. So let's say, something that might need a rock plate that is thin enough, it might need a rock plate. Um, we're right now working on a shoe that's coming out May 15th called the Wander. It's going to be a 24-28 stack 4 mil drop with a flexible rock plate. It's we're jokingly calling it the Lone Peak Killer, um, because Lone Peak's been the best selling trail shoe. It took over the Cascadia about a while ago, maybe a decade ago, and it's been the best selling trail shoe on the market since then. And part of that's because of its big following in like the through hiking uh, and hiking crowd. But we've been jokingly calling that the Lone Peak Killer because it's around the same stack, but it's lighter. But the point is like for me, that's like my lower end shoe that's working on foot strength, right? Ground contact. So that's something I would want to mix in my like maintenance runs, hour and a half runs, and really work on like keeping my feet strong and like used to feeling the ground, right? You'll strike with less force when you're in a thinner shoe. All kinds of little form things happen naturally when you're in a thinner shoe. And then you would go to like your probably quiver one is the mid cushion shoe, somewhere in that upper 20 stack, low 30 stack, 30 millimeter stack, somewhere in there. Personally, I'm big advocate for anything under a 5 mil drop. So 4 or 5 mil drops kind of ideal for me. Something with a little bit of rocker, especially once we get into that mid cushion higher stack. Because you can have a rocker, you have enough room to cut out a rocker in it. So I think that's probably like your best like all arounder, right? We're working right now on a shoe that's going to come out spring 27. That I'm supposed to have a prototype in May for that will be a mountain racer shoe, and it'll be right in that middle range, 4 mil drop, in that 30-ish stack height. And then we have a maximalist shoe right now on the market that's a 6 mil drop. It's like 33, 39. So it's more of like in that more maximalist kind of category. And I think those three kind of categories, mid cushion, max cushion, and thinner, are kind of your ideal trilogy quiver. And you should be mixing all of those in. Maybe the big stack height might be like your late in 100 shoe, or it might be like your recovery day shoe when you're beat up, or and maybe your race shoe is the mid cushion one, and maybe your training tool is the lower one, and it really depends on people too. Like everyone strikes differently. So like, I coach Michael Versteeg and he loves a thin shoe. Like even running Cocodona 250, he's going to run it in like a 18 like 22 stack. It's like super thin with no rock plate, right? But like that's his preference. He likes like that ground feel. I have another friend that only runs in the Superior, right? He'll run up to 100 miles in the like Ultra Superior and it's super thin. So, it really depends on personal preference too when it comes to like what kind of stack or drop and what your body's used to too, I think, because you always have to figure in a transition time if you're going to do any kind of significant move in drop.
Mhm. Awesome. That's
Yeah.
good. Let's open up for Q&A. So with that, we are wrapping up this portion of the podcast. The Q&A is for My First Ultra members only. So if you want to join the My First Ultra community and get live Q&A, with guests like Jeff, or you want to see the Q&A with this portion, you get access to all the replays and live interaction with our guests. So go to myendurance.life.com, look for My First Ultra. Join there and you'll be blown away. Plus, I give you all the training guides for free, whether you're just starting out or going for a 100 miler. They're all included 25K to 100 miles. Thanks for watching. Stick around because our next guest is going to be just as good. Katra Corbett, the Dirt Diva, is going to be joining us. If you want to watch that, stick around here.